Hello, everyone. I'm Josh, and the book that I chose for my core project was The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski. Jerzy Kosinski was a Polish American novelist, uh, born in 1933 in Poland, and he was of Jewish descent. His name when he was born was not actually Jerzy Kosinski, but he had it changed to that, or rather, his family had it changed to that. Um, Amongst other things that he had changed, or like relatively like shortly after he was born, was his religious certificate. So he made it as though he had a baptism. Um, and he was relocated, and he lived with an Austrian family from a very young age, um, before eventually like traveling around Western Europe, and then even after that, moving to America. Some of the things that he personally experienced or did was he went to college in Western Europe, of course, and he got two bachelor's degrees in sociology and psychology. He was a sniper for the Soviet army, um, and all of this was done before in his like mid 20s he decided to move to America, and that's when he became a novelist and he started writing his books. As you can imagine, coming from Poland, English was not his first language. So when he came to America, the books he was writing were actually in English, despite this, because one of the things that his father made a point to do was to teach him English and to make sure that he understood it, because his father was a mathematician, and even though he was a man of few words, this was one of the things he wanted to pass down to his son. So this is just a little bit of the background, at least in terms of things that he did, or at least that are known about Jerzy Kosinski, because there's a lot of controversy surrounding him as an individual. Because, well, from the things I listed, there are some things that are unknown about his past, or rather, that are um, rather up for debate, right? And a lot of this debate stems from the Painted Bird itself. But in terms of the actual historical context itself, like I said, he was born in 1933, which was 6 short years before what would become to known as World War II occurred. And of course, during World War II, we're familiar with the Holocaust that happened with it, in which Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime stormed through Western Europe, gathering Jews and Gypsies, and of course, stripping them of their civil rights due with his Nuremberg laws, and then placing them in poverty-stricken locations known as ghettos, and then taking them to concentration camps where he would gas them or burn them, um, often both, actually gassing then burning, and just various torturous methods of killing them and experimenting on them, right? The Painted Bird presents the story of a young boy, who is 6 at the beginning. It ends when he's around 12, and he's traveling around Western Europe, and it's just a catalog of the various experiences that he has as he's doing this. And the reason why there is much debate about Kaczynski's Kaczynski's past is because this novel, it seems almost autobiographical in its nature. Um, Mostly because the occurrences that are described, they're just so incredibly graphic, so incredibly violent, so incredibly just morally decrepit that they seem too real to not be true. They seem too cruel to not be real, right? And so it led to a lot of readers wondering, is this coming from a place within that is true? Is this just a really sick man writing really sick stories? Is this what you experienced? Yeah. And the controversy stems from the fact that it's unknown relative, or rather, he presented it as if that was the case at first. However, years later, after it was essentially proven that it was not the case, and that he had created this novel based on accounts of other individuals who actually lived through this type of stuff, a lot of his credibility was put into question. And as such, it led to him eventually, like amongst there were other things going on in his life, but it was one of the things that significantly contributed to him eventually taking his life. So the novel that I'm about to describe to you guys, The Painted Bird, it it heavily impacted the literary community, in terms of how it presented the world from the viewpoint of this young boy. Um, yeah. So at the beginning of the novel, we're introduced to a young boy. We're not given his name. All we know is that he's about 6, because he makes a point at some point to say that he's only 6. So we know his age. We know he's a boy, and we know that he's of a gypsy slash Jewish descent, because he doesn't really know where he's from, or rather, he doesn't remember it entirely. Um, so we know enough about his cultural background to know that in this time period, him being who he is, it's dangerous for him. His family, there's like a little introduction at the beginning that makes it clear that his family had given him up and tried to essentially evacuate him to a like random Austrian village to keep him safe, so that he could be hidden and he wouldn't be found, and that because they felt that if they were with him, they wouldn't have been able to keep him safe on their own. So another thing that we know, sorry, is that he is of a wealthy background, or relatively wealthy at least. They're not like royalty or anything, but they're wealthy enough to be well educated. Um, so he's placed in these Austrian or in an Austrian village with very traditional, very setback-minded people, if that makes sense. In the sense that their worldviews are rather limited. Um, Despite being Christian, of like Eastern Orthodox or Catholic, what have you, um, they they still hold these very old world ideas in terms of like evil spirits, and the way that they uh, interact with the world around us. And so we're first introduced to an old woman that he's staying with, who she sees him and she believes that his black gypsy eyes are capable of casting spells on people, and that if he were to look at her teeth and count them, then he would be shortening her life like 1 year with every tooth she has, which she's an old woman. There aren't many. Um, she has these ideas that if she has an ache in her body, she must take meat and put it in a jar and let it sit in a corner of the room until it goes bad, and then her pain will come back and she just got to repeat the process, so on and so forth. She has these views, and these aren't just her views, they're shared within the community that he's staying at. And so he's treated very poorly for it. He, at least with her, the abuse that he suffers is mostly physical, and of course emotional and mental. Right? She tells him how he's evil and how he is the reason for why they're experiencing what they are. Like whenever they suffer in any sort of way, that it's basically his fault. That any pain she feels is his fault, and so she often gets mad at him and tells him to close his eyes as he walks around the house so that he doesn't curse anything. Um, as you can imagine, he's not living a really great life at this point, and he's only 6, like I said. So one of the few joys he has in life, or few friends he has in life, is this random squirrel. And one day he sees these boys within the village who are walking around with like a can, and they see the squirrel, and they pour the contents of the can on the squirrel, and they set it on fire. And as he listens to the screams of the squirrel, he sits there and he contemplates how he wishes that he could have helped, or he could have done something, anything, and there's nothing that he could have done. And considering, or let me continue, sorry. After this, what was ironic about that is later the old woman ends up dying, but he's not aware of this. He thinks that she's just sort of staring off and looking at the wall just very intensely. And he's actually quite moved by this. He's like, wow, this is dedication. He sees it and he's thinking to himself that this is impressive, But one day the fire goes out in there and he tries to put it back. And in his efforts to do so, he sets the actual cottage on fire and he watches her burn, you know. And it's very graphic in its description of him watching her burn, like watching the muscle appear and the bone eventually, and all of that turning to char and ash. And it's it's one way to definitely set the scene of what's to come for what we're going to see in the novel, because it certainly isn't the most graphic thing that we'll experience. From here going on, we just watch the boy as he goes to different places and how he's treated and how the people in these places are treated, and how other random people will show up and how they treat wherever, it's all interactions with humans that are overall like net terrible. He ends up drawing conclusions about the world that he sees, and that are sexual in nature, about religion, and just about how we as humans treat one another. um, I think good ways to, I guess, characterize that are just examples of all that. So um, maybe the most important one, or rather, at least that was worth naming the book after, right? The Painted Bird. Uh, at one experience, he finds himself staying with a bird catcher named Lick, and the bird catcher is very good at what he does. He's the only one in the village who's capable of doing it, and he catches these birds, and he sometimes sets up specific nests because they have these prophecies that if the specific bird is to land on your house, then you'll have good luck. So of course the families want him to do that. He'll go out into the forest and he'll catch specific birds and he'll put them on display. Like he's just very good at what he does. Well, he's a very old man, and he's in love with another woman who happens to at least roam around that sort of village. Her name is Livmilla, or as the people call her in the village, Stupid Livmilla. And she earned the name essentially because she was very beautiful when she was young, and she's I said when she was young, she's still very beautiful, at least physically, I think is a good way to put that, because when she was young, her family wanted to marry her off to a wealthy farmer boy, which wouldn't have been very wealthy, but at least within the context of where they were staying, it was some wealth. And he was very ugly. She said no, she didn't want to marry him. And so he decided that he would have the village get together. They would have her drink a bunch of alcohol, get her nice and drunk up, or get her drunk, and they all took their turns with her. And she was never the same after this experience, as you would imagine no one would be the same after such an experience. But she was very promiscuous within the village afterwards, and she wouldn't even live in the village. She like sort of wore a sack and sort of just roamed around the forest, and she had her own little dog who they even made rumors about her having kind of relations with the dog, right? But every now and then she would take random men from the village and they would go out and sneak out and do the acts that they would do, and then they would come back home, and the wives of course were not very fond of this. And so you can imagine that she ended up having a bad reputation with the men of the village and an even worse one with the women of the village. But Lek was in love with her, and she was in love with Lek. And while sexually he may not have been as satisfactory to her as she would have liked because he was old, um, emotionally, even spiritually, one would say they got along. They were able to just go within the fields and talk to each other and understand each other. Uh, but one day, or honestly, just several days, when Lek would want to go and see her and she wasn't available, or he just couldn't get a hold of her, he would be upset enough to capture birds that were flying in flocks, or rather, like one bird out of the flock. And then he would take it and he would paint it different colors. He would paint its wings, its chest, its beak. He would just make it a different array of colors and make it look different from how it originally looked. And then he would set it free back into the flock, and he would watch as the flock would end up not being able to recognize the bird any longer, tear it limb from limb, tearing out its eyes, tearing off its wings, and just essentially killing it because it seemed like a threat because it was foreign. Um, and and the boy watched this and he thought to himself, "Wow, so this is what the world must be like, right? Where we see each other, and because we're all different from each other, we look for what's different. We're persecuted for it. We're treated like we're threats just because we're not the same." And of course, this is just one of many circumstances where he ends up drawing conclusions about the world around him because he's at a young age and he has nothing better to do. But at this time, it's not like he was completely wrong, right? Because that's what the Holocaust was. It was us taking these people, and because they were different from us, whether it was a cultural or religion or nationality, because they were different, we killed them. Or not we, but you know what I mean. The Nazis killed them. But after this occurred, and after I get the monologue in his head of this happening, Ludmilla shows up later, and she She tries to find Lek, but Lek has left, not like permanently. He just sort of went off somewhere to drink his vodka and to just brood about not being able to see her. And she was upset that he wasn't there either. And so she takes some vodka herself. She takes the boy and she tries to essentially rape him in the woods. And she's interrupted in her attempt to do so as random men end up showing up from the village, and she decides, you know what, they'll have to do for now. And they get to it, and somehow or another, the random women of the village end up finding her, and they end up beating her dog to death with a shovel, and then they end up beating her half to death. And then in the middle of it, they take a glass bottle filled with like manure and urine, and they shove it inside of her, and then they kick it and kick her repeatedly until she's dead. Um, and as you can imagine, that was also a very graphic scene. But of course, it that chapter influenced the boy very heavily, and you can imagine that the reader seeing that was definitely going to be taken aback too, in terms of like the just sheer gruesomeness and brutality of the scene that was presented there. Um, Amongst other things that we end up seeing, there's like a miller that he ends up living with. There's a very like a jealous relationship between him and his wife, where his wife seems to be very flirtatious, and the various men of the village seem to be very fond of his wife. And one day he takes matters into his own hands, and he finds himself gouging out the eyes of one of the farm hands who's looking at his wife in a way that he feels is too affectionate. Um, all that to say, very gruesome scenes that occurred within this book. But after this episode with Milla and Lek, he finds himself just traveling from village to village and living with various cottage people. And in some of the cottages, he's just abused on a daily basis. He's beaten. He's, of course, talked down to. In some, it's not necessarily that he's physically abused, it's that he's sexually abused. In fact, there was one where there was an older, older young woman. At least she was older than him, and he was like 7 or 8 at the time, right? And she would tell him to touch her in specific places and to do specific things to her, and he had no choice but to do it. And of course, that ended up changing the way that he saw like the sexual acts that men is capable of, right? And he saw that there are ways for it to be beautiful and ways for it to not be, because he had experienced two sides of the spectrum, where one was very intimate and very passionate, and others where it was very violent and just brutal, and it ended up framing the way that he would see, like at least the way that he saw the world sexually. I think another powerful scene that it was powerful because it changed the way that he saw himself. One day he heard legends of like a rivaling set of people called the Kalmuks, and what they would do is they would ride into towns and they would just pillage the towns. And pillaging isn't just we're going to ride in on our horses, kick over a few stuff, and then leave. No, they came in, they killed multiple people, they would rape the women several times, sometimes multiple men to one woman at the same time. Like it was grotesque. I combined two things, brutal and grotesque. And it was an experience, but what was, despite all this graphic imagery, what was most important and most, I think, disturbing about it was he found himself thinking, holy crap, these people that they describe, they look like how I look, with the dark eyes, the dark hair, the maybe not as fair skin, sort of like at least a little bit more tan. And he found himself thinking, maybe I am evil as an individual. Maybe if this is who I look like, as opposed to looking like these other village people, this must be who my identity is and what I'm capable of. And he ends up making this realization and just assuming that he's evil as an individual. And you, as the reader, you feel sorry for a person who would do this, knowing that they're at a young age, they're impressionable, and they don't know what else to think and what else to believe. But but like I said, there's also like religious influences where in one chapter he finds himself hung like by his arms again like a farm, and there's this dog that the owner would sick onto him and try to get it to bite him repeatedly, and he had to suspend himself and basically like as if he were on a cross, right, and try to hold himself up to make sure that the dog wouldn't get to him. And at times like that, the only thing that he had to fall back on was prayer. And so in one chapter we see how dependent he becomes on this prayer as he tries to pray each and every moment that he is living, so that it can hopefully pay off at some point, so that he will be safe and he can have days of leisure essentially. And then on the other hand, like on the contrast, we have a few chapters later where he has a situation where he ends up going to Russia, and they're of course at this time they're like they're communists at this time. They're communists, and it's the rise of Stalin, I believe, at the time. And so of course he has his new proposed ideas with the Russian Revolution that's occurring, and he's seeing all this education and all of this equality that they're proposing, and the propaganda that they're putting out, and he has nothing else to hold on to. So he finds himself holding on to this and becoming attracted to the soldiers that he sees and the scholars that he sees, and wanting to rely on brute force and muscle, and realizing that this is what runs the world. And so he finds himself, sorry, that's redundant, turning away from the religion that he once fell back onto, seeing it as purposeless and pointless, and obviously not as helpful to him, because he was trying to rely on some higher being that he wasn't even sure was there, and now he felt that he was going to rely on himself. And then something else that I guess I didn't even mention, as like an in between, he went from realizing that he needed God to one day thinking it's the evil people who are thriving, so maybe I need to be relying on something evil, or I need to, the evil that's within me, I need to try and get a hold of it and try to control it and use it, so he goes from trying to rely on good to trying to rely on evil to trying to eventually rely on himself, no matter what that means. um, and eventually, once he leaves this like just Russian military environment, he finds himself in an orphanage, because the soldiers that he meets, they actually care about him to some extent. They're like, okay, look, we need you to be in a decent home. And by this point in time, he's like 11 or 12. So he finds himself in an orphanage in Russia, living with other children who've, truth be told, experienced things that were just as, if not more terrible than what that us, the audience, having read the book, experienced with him, things more terrible than that. And so we see this dynamic of him interacting with these other kids, and it's not, yes, I got to play with the kids in the yard. It was, no, there were fights, and there were brutal fights. And one of them was known for stabbing other kids, and one of them was known for lighting other kids on fire, and one of them was known for punching people like specifically in their groin, or like this violence still doesn't go away once he finds this place that is at least considerably more uh, comfortable than any of the villages he would have stayed in before. Eventually, at the end of the novel, he reconnects with his parents. But what's most saddening to me is that despite this, he's not happy, or he's not overjoyed to finally be in a home. No, he has known freedom, and he has known being on his own for so long at this point, and has learned to become so independent and depend on himself. It's redundant at this point, that being in this home feels strange to him. It doesn't feel right. In fact, he's not excited to be moving into this home and finding that he has real parents, and that his little brother, apparently, that he has someone to care for as well. And so at the very, very end, he gets a phone call from one of the Russian soldiers that he had connected to very closely. And as far as we see it, he ends up reconnecting with this person and being able to go back with them into the Russian military. But the book as a whole, despite all of the gruesome and just horrible imagery and just horrible experiences, it's a story about just the fragile nature of the human condition, and how we are influenced by these things that we see, and how we are outcast as individuals, how this can affect us when we're placed in situations where we we have to fend for ourselves, and we're looked down upon, and we don't have anyone else to rely on but ourselves. It's how do we overcome this, and how do we still find value in ourselves to be able to rise above this and do and become better, you know. And that's ultimately what this story was about for this young boy. So as you can imagine, with all of these terrible things happening and people just assuming that this had to come from somewhere, this is where the argument for whether or not it was truly Kaczynski's background or not was stemmed from. Um, Ultimately, I don't think it is important. It still relayed an important part of history that we often do not hear from. We're all familiar with Anne Frank's diaries, right? And while those were definitely enlightening in their own right, of another individual trying to live through these times and just trying to, live in hiding and still find a way to live, to seek some sort of normalcy in life. We get this other experience that's just significantly more graphic, significantly more brutal. Um, and people went through this. Like I said in the afterword, the old people at the old people's home that he went to and interviewed about this type of thing, they wondered why he watered it down and why he wasn't as straightforward about the things that occurred as he could have been. And this was still a narrative that was shared. It may not have been the exact same, but this is a part of history that we often do not read in the history books. And I don't mean that in the sense that it's unknown to us that the Jews experienced terrible things, but we don't know the degree to which they experienced terrible things, you know? And that was what made this book so disturbing. Where when I was reading it, I was thinking to myself just over and over again, wow, wow, I was lost for words. And history doesn't portray that as well as it probably should, or as well as it needs to, in order for us to understand just how wrong it was that the Holocaust even happened. Um, I think that's obviously a connection that can be made to today in terms of us just how we treat each other and how we seek to better the way that we look at each other in terms of equals. And um, I think an even more relevant takeaway is a lot, or I'm not going to say a lot, but some of the novels that Kaczynski has made have been turned into movies. Um, One of which was called Being There. It was made into a movie, I want to say, in the either early 70s or late 60s. Um, but this one is also being made into a movie. So since I have the option of sharing the screen, I wanted to see if I could show you the actual trailer. So let's see if I can do that. Um, Thumbnail? Error occurred. If you can't see it, then I'll just tell you it's The Painted Bird 2019. Look it up on YouTube. But hopefully you'll be able to see it. I'm assuming you can. If not, this is going to be an embarrassing